What is a complete human? Is it a cover model? Is it a science geek? Is it a fitness expert? Or all of the above and more? Janna and Evan are crusaders that walk the earth looking at today's issues that touch our hearts and minds. The honest and hopeful outlook on the advancement of today's society. The science behind the decay of human relationships. The necessary preparations for future generations. Join us as we look deep inside ourselves and embark on a journey into becoming a complete human.
Hey everybody, Evan DeMarco here. Most of you have heard about CBD over the last couple of years, and as one of the most successful product formulators in the CBD marketplace, I am intimately familiar with what it can and cannot do. With everything from miracle cures for cancer to regrowing hair to improving sex, the claims around CBD have been fanciful, if not completely false. You see, CBD is a great product, but it does have a very indirect impact on our bodies. That is why I was excited to create a product that uses some of the novel phytocannabinoids directly from our USDA-certified organic farms right here in the US. These novel cannabinoids, like CBC and CBG, have been proven to have a direct impact on our bodies, especially for things like stress, anxiety, and pain. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to make the very best product for our customers. So I created a unique lipid delivery system to rapidly increase bioavailability. I also added a few extra goodies like beta-caryophyllene to really help with pain and recovery. CBC Plus is the next generation of phytocannabinoid products for the complete human. So head over to CompleteHumanCBC.com to get your bottle today. That's CompleteHumanCBC.com. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your hosts,
Janna Breslin
and Evan DeMarco. How do we use mindfulness to master self? So it seems like we hear a lot about this in daily life and all of the podcasts, but I think we hear about it in a rather kind of esoteric or abstract sense. People talk about mindfulness, they talk about meditation, but there's really not a roadmap of sorts of what that does, what it means, and how we capitalize that on our life. So I guess I'm kind of stoked about this because our guest today might just be the leading global expert on this topic.
Right. Habits and addictions.
Habits and addictions. And we all have a couple of those.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm looking at you.
Yes, we do.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to introduce Dr. Jud Brewer.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Yeah. So, obviously we're going to include all of your information in the intro on this one, but just give us a quick 35,000 foot view on who you are.
Yeah. So hi, my name is Jud. I'm a dude that suffers a lot. And I've tried to turn that into the benefit, not for myself, but for everybody. Being in medical school, I started meditating because I was stressed out, didn't know how my own mind worked. 25 years later, I'm a neuroscientist. I'm an addiction psychiatrist. My lab studies habit change. I help, I train people. We even develop digital therapeutics, app-based mindfulness training programs to help people with break bad habits, everything from smoking to overeating to even the habit of anxiety and worry.
And that is something that we are going to talk a lot about, if for no other reason than it just might be free therapy for Janet.
My broadcast therapy session.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time.
Right.
So let's talk a lot about that. Or I'd like you to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that itself. These kind of the rumination, shall we say? I mean, this is really, it went from, dare I say, just something that was topical to almost, pandemic level, especially during a pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is huge. And in fact, this is I just published this book, Unwinding Anxiety, that really highlights a lot of this, which, I don't think any of us saw coming. And it really is, it's unfortunately a very interesting natural science experiment, not only in terms of all the immune aspects, but really looking at psychology, how we work as humans. So one way to think about this, or maybe frame this, is around our brains and how we survive, right? So we have very basic learning mechanisms that basically help us find food and not be food, eat and not be eaten. And those mechanisms, that's our survival brain. On top of that was layered a newer part of the brain, literally the neocortex, the new brain. And that helps us survive in a different way through thinking and planning. So it actually takes previous scenarios and information, and it simulates the future based on that. It predicts the future based on what we've done in the past. Yet it needs accurate information. So, when I need to go to the airport, I can simulate going to the airport and figure out how much time I need for traffic based on time of day and all of that. But how about a pandemic? Hey guys, the last pandemic was 1918, right? None of us were alive for that one, so we don't have any previous experience with it. But our brains don't stop. They don't just say, okay, lots of uncertainty, let's go on, let's get on with things. They say, I got to figure this out. So we go on social media, we get all this crazy, a fire hose of information that we have to sort through. So back in our ancient ancestors' days, there were no like deep fake saber-toothed tigers, or there were no, factions saying, oh, saber-toothed tigers are good. No, saber-toothed tigers are bad. It was all saber-toothed tiger, you ran because it was real, right? So not only do we have to sift through a ton of information, there's also misinformation, and all of that spreads through social contagion. So when our brains don't get accurate information, they start spinning out into worry. Oh no, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? And ironically, that's when our thinking and planning brain goes offline. So we start to spin out into anxiety and worry, which then feeds more anxiety rather than helping keep us safe.
I think we both have done that, right? Like, we start sifting through social media, you see one report that says this, you see one person who says this, you've got a friend who had COVID who, was completely fine. You have another friend who spent 6 weeks in the hospital. And so in the middle of all of this, we have been just bombarded with information. So in the context of like, you say saber-toothed tiger, that's a very real thing, descends on the tribe, you either run or you're dinner. With COVID, with all of the disinformation, how do we actually begin to make sense of all of that medically, on the brain side of things? And then how do we start to compartmentalize that so that we can live without this constant, modern saber-toothed tiger looming over us?
Yeah. So as much as the internet is helpful, we can't just go online and become a doctor. We can't just go online and become an immunologist. We can't just go online and become an epidemiologist, right? And we can't go online and become a psychiatrist, although I'm sure some people try. So
probably more than they should.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, so I was gonna say I have plenty of patients who come in and they're like, "Oh, I didn't imagine you being this way." I'm like, "Oh, you've been watching movies and going on the internet." Yeah. So, yeah.
Lay on the couch,
real dude. Yeah, exactly. And they're like, "Where's the couch?" So, yeah, no couch needed here. So the key here really is it starts with understanding how our minds work. It's amazing how little we know about how our minds work. I didn't even learn this in medical school or residency. Some of these basic things are how they lined up with things like anxiety.
So I guess that kind of brings up my question: is if we were to get rid of the internet, would COVID be as bad of a thing as it is?
That's a great question. It depends on what you mean by bad. Would it be as infectious? Yeah, the R naught probably is not dependent on social media ratings. But so physical characteristics of a virus are a certain way. But you could also think if things went well on the internet and people spread good information and the latest guidelines were updated quickly and disseminated, that would be great. Disseminating public health measures is a wonderful, helpful thing. And getting that out, imagine being on the prairie in the 1800s and you have to wait for the Pony Express, and hope the dude doesn't have COVID when he delivers it, right? So here, information is helpful. It's just how it's delivered that can make things unhelpful, where then people start fighting over simple health measures like mask wearing.
Yeah. It's crazy times.
Oh God, take me back to the Pony Express days.
It is.
3 hours till dinner? Piece of cake.
join us for drinks.
Sorry, girls. He's making me dinner tonight. See you tomorrow.
Well, get it, girl, then.
Yeah. Wow, this looks great. Come this way.
Well, what about dinner?
We'll get to that later.
Dr. Jud, I listened to another podcast that you were on, and you mentioned that you had your own kind of habit and addiction that you were dealing with, I guess, and that was your own thoughts, your own thinking. Can you explain a little bit about that and kind of what you learned?
Yes, actually, I wrote my whole first book called The Craving Mind about all the addictions that I didn't know I had until I went through my training and realized that I had these.
Yeah.
But and then actually the next chapter to that was my own anxiety, and I had panic attacks during residency, which is why I wrote this unwinding anxiety book. But the idea is that I thought I had all these great ideas in the world, and I would go on these silent meditation retreats for like a month at a time, and my brain would be like, that's a great idea, like for my next lab experiment. And it would feel like it was such a great idea that I would have to get off the cushion and go write it down. And it took me several days of doing this to realize that my mind just didn't want to sit and meditate. And, it's like, oh, just get up and write this down, because then it can not only, not sit there, but it could also help me indulge in what I thought. I just started to name these the world's greatest idea. None of them are. But it was my mind tricking me. Yeah, it was totally ego. It's totally the ego. Even with, and you can have I can have a big ego without even involving other people. It can just be believing my own hype. Like, oh, that is a great idea. Oh yeah.
Like,
yeah,
you're a genius.
No kidding.
I love that.
Yeah, none of my ideas are great. Just for the record.
So interesting. So you mentioned there are a lot of uncommon, habits and addictions that we have that maybe we don't really realize that we have. Like, what are some of those? Because we think about cigarettes or social media or porn or other these things that are more well known as addictions. But what are some of these other things that maybe are lesser known?
I think the sneakiest one that I didn't know about was worry itself as a mental behavior that could drive habits. So just to give a little background to let that settle in, because people are like, what? How is worry a habit? When I trained in psychiatry, prescribed medications, blah, blah, blah. And I was basically getting anxious about treating my own patients, because the best medications out there, the best class of medications, there's this term, number needed to treat, how many people you need to treat before one person shows a significant reduction in symptoms. That number in anxiety treatment is 5.15. So I was basically playing the medication lottery, where 20% of my patients were winning and the others not so much. Okay. So I would start to get anxious. But
Is it that scary?
Yeah, I know. I'm like, it's like it's not like medications are bad. For some people, they're helpful, but I just didn't realize how, until I was doing this myself, that my hit rate wasn't great, and it wasn't me writing the prescription. It was the medication. So here I started looking to see what we were missing, and there was some little known or little publicized research from the 1980s. This was back when all the medications were big. The Stones were singing about benzodiazepines because they were being prescribed like candy. What is it? Mother's Little Helper, and running to the shelter of Mother's Little Helper, and it helped her on her way. That's benzos, right? So it wasn't that she was dropping acid. That was benzodiazepines. So in the 80s, everybody's looking at medications as like, miracle, miracle Prozac and whatever. And they were overlooking this work Thomas Borkovic and others talked about, where they suggested that worry can actually drive anxiety as a habit. And when I read that, my eyes popped out of my head. And when I put them back in, I was like, oh my goodness, because I know something about habits. And I had been doing a bunch of work, 5 times the gold standard, quit rates for smoking, 40% reduction in craving related eating with people overeating. We'd done a bunch of great work there with habits, but I never thought about worry as a habit. So there's one that gets driven and it basically goes the same way as any other habit, right? So trigger, behavior, result, right? The survival mechanism is you see food, you eat food, your stomach sends this dopamine signal to your brain. So you remember where it is, right? See danger, run away, live. So worry gets perpetuated the same way. Trigger can be anxiety or just a thought or seeing something. We start to worry, oh no. And then the result is that we feel like we're in control, right? We feel like we're doing something. It's like the parent of the teenager that goes out, the teenager goes out partying and the parent starts worrying all night. I can promise you, I'm sure there's science behind this, that their worrying didn't keep their kids safe. Okay. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that's true. Okay.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But the parent, because they can't do anything, that worrying gives them something to do. So they feel like they're doing something. And so it feeds back and drives more anxiety until the doorknob opens. And then suddenly they're so exhausted from worrying, they just fall right to sleep. The parent does, right?
Or do in a certain extent, do they believe that because they were worrying that brought the kid home safe? So it reinforces that behavior.
That's a really good question or really good thought, because here there's this whole myth around performance anxiety, right? There's this thing called the Yorks Dodson Law. I write about this in my Unwinding Anxiety book as well. 1908 study, a study of Japanese dancing mice that got reified through the ages into law, just based on somebody giving a lecture in the 50s with no data, down to people writing books and saying, oh, you have to have some anxiety to perform well. Just like, oh, if I worry, my kid's going to be safe. My PhD mentor, Lou Muglia, he used to call this true, and unrelated. You have to prove that there's a causal connection. You could be worrying, your kid could come home safe, but you can't prove that your worrying actually caused that. But our brains are associative learning machines. They just love to make these connections without actually going through and saying, is that actually true? They're just like, yeah, it must be true. Kids
so our
safe.
ego jumps in and says, wow, that actually worked. I was right. Now I can worry my way to, my kid's health or, all of these outcomes.
Yeah. And then parents can get together and they can start competing on who worries more or better.
It's just like a cyclical cycle. That sounds.
Yeah, that sounds like something, like worrying clubs in the burbs. Like come for a Tupperware party and a worrying party. If we could find a way to turn that into a multi-level marketing platform, yeah.
You'd be gazillionaires. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could buy an island in Hawaii, or all of Hawaii.
All of them.
So how does this kind of tie into the default mode network? Because I know you've talked a lot about that.
Yeah. My lab, when it started studying experienced versus novice meditators, this was over 10 years ago, we serendipitously tripped across this network of brain regions called the default mode network, which ironically is what we default to when we're not doing anything in particular. And what we do when we're not doing anything in particular, this is ego related, who do we think about? We think about ourselves, right? Oh, I can't believe I did that. So we regret things in the past. Oh, what's going to happen? We worry about the future. We're not actually just hanging out in the present moment. And when we're in the present, we're worrying and we're regretting and we're worrying. We're doing all these things. So those mental behaviors, that rumination or the perseveration, that drives activity in this default mode network. So it's been shown this network gets really active, gets really hot, it gets heated up when we regret things, when we worry about things. It also gets heated up when we crave things, when we want more chocolate or want more cigarettes or whatever. So this network of brain regions gets really hot basically when we get caught up in our experience, okay? We get caught up in worry, get caught up in regret, get caught up in a craving, okay? I should say, interestingly, this network gets really quiet when somebody is meditating, because meditation is about letting go of ourselves. And literally, we've done neurofeedback studies where it's about helping people see what it's like to get caught up in their experience. And then when people see that they're caught up, then they can also see what it's like to let go. And that letting go quality of experience actually feels much better. And we can actually capture this in real time, whether it's with fMRI or EEG. We even had Anderson Cooper come in and try it out on film for 60 minutes once. That was a great thing, where he got really anxious and then his his network got really active, and then we had to meditate and it got really quiet. So there's a pretty clear connection between getting caught up in these things and activating this default mode network, and getting, doing things to help us learn to let go of this. And I'll give a concrete example. My lab just studied a paper, or published a paper in 2019, where we brought in people that wanted to quit smoking. Okay. And there's Amy James at Harvard developed this great paradigm where you could get this network really active when you show smokers pictures of cigarettes, right? So we can measure their default mode network activity at baseline. Then we can randomize them. This is what scientists love to do. A versus B, what happens? We randomize them to get our app-based mindfulness training program. It's called Craving and Quit, versus the National Cancer Institute's app called Quit Guide. And then a month later, we could scan their brains again and see what predicted outcomes. And in fact, we found a direct correlation between a reduction in default mode network activity and a reduction in smoking, but this was specific to the mindfulness training group, not the other group at all. So here we can see, okay, the theory of something like mindfulness is to help people let go. You can target a specific brain network, and that predicts clinical outcomes. To me, that's like the holy trinity. It's like theory lines up with brain mechanism, lines up with clinical outcomes.
That's so cool. I don't know if this is, I don't know if there's any resolution to my next question, but as you talk about this, I can't help but think that we are a evolutionary mistake, right? You talk about the neocortex, which gives us this ability to perceive the future, to, take information from the past. But in doing so, we've created all of these problems, right? And I don't know, were we evolutionarily designed to meditate? That doesn't seem like that was a foundational practice of our nomadic ancestors. So are we kind of evolutionary a big cock up?
Also, but are we evolutionarily supposed to have addictions as well? I mean, I don't know. So I think with desperate times also calls for desperate measures, and you have to have, but I'd love to hear your take.
Oh, both of those are such great questions. So let's start with the addiction piece, and then we'll lean into the, are we an evolutionary mistake? So if you think about this, this is just our basic survival mechanism. So it's important to have reinforcement learning processes so we can find food, we can avoid danger. Yet historically, I don't know when this started, but when people started refining substances, right? So you could distill alcohol, you could refine coca leaves into cocaine, take opium, and you could make heroin, you could get, just get opium itself. We started creating and manufacturing and distilling, literally sometimes, these substances that were addictive. So we kind of tripped into these types of things. But if you look at it carefully, this is just these natural substances like coca leaves. They were used by indigenous people forever in a non-addictive way that actually helped them survive, right? We take this and we say, I think tobacco is one of my favorite examples. So tobacco plants make nicotine, which is a toxin. So nicotine has a very low LD50, like lethal dose 50 for humans. If you inject a small amount of nicotine in your bloodstream, you die, right? So they make this so that animals will not eat them.
Yeah.
Right? So we as humans were like, oh, this is a great idea. And somehow, they figured out you could dry these leaves, you could smoke them. And when you got over the initial part where your body's saying, hey, this is dangerous, right? Because when you first smoke a cigarette, you throw up because your body's like, hey, you're injecting toxin. Are you sure you want to do this? And we're like, oh, I'd rather be cool at school. Yes, I definitely want to do this. So I'll go, I'll throw up in the trash can a few times until I get tolerant to this. And then I can get the stimulating effects of it, right? So we've refined these things, and it's just our old survival brain that's still just trying to keep up with us. So whether it's substances or food or social media, right? The more we know how our brains work, the more we can use that information, let's just say, in different ways. So if you want somebody to get addicted, we know a whole lot about how to do that. You refine a substance, you hit the dopamine system. If you want to get somebody addicted to social media, you have surprise, you have intermittent reinforcement, you do all these things that gets them addicted, right? It's not that our brains, so I would say, to long answer your short question, we are kind of designed to be addicted, but it's not really that we're designed for addiction. It's just that the process of information has outcompeted literally the physical changes in our brains. These are old survival brains that are a little slow. They lumber along, whereas in social media, you can do a study, with a large company, you can do a study literally with 1 million or 1 billion people in a day. And this is happening with large platforms where they can be like A versus B, A versus B, A versus B. And so they can actually make that even more sticky every day if that's the goal. So that's the addiction piece. So, and here I would say, is that a mistake? I'm not sure that evolution makes mistakes. Again, I'm just guessing. So I'm sure an evolutionary biologist could shoot me down on this. Please do. This is not my lane. But just giving you some BS, some baseless speculation.
I love that.
I'm not sure that evolution does mistakes in that sense. It might fall into little, like kind of dead ends every now and then. But overall, that's going to move along.
Makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
We wanted to discuss we've talked a lot about the dangers of social media on the show, and I want to get into that. I think before we do that, I think one addiction that gets brought up time and time again is sexual addiction. And this is one that I've been very curious about. We look at alcohol, and if you remove alcohol from your system, you can live. The species can live. If you remove cigarettes and nicotine from your system, the species will carry on. Interestingly enough, sex is one of those where if we all stop having sex based off of an addiction, well, humanity dies.
Yeah.
So I've been very curious to, your take on this one. And is sex actually an addiction, or based off of those dopamine hits, which we are evolutionarily conditioned for? Is that one of those things that's still our desire or our innate ability to perpetuate the species?
Yeah. That's a great question. I want to walk into this using maybe a simpler example, because sometimes, people think sex and then, their brain goes offline. So, okay, people, we're going to talk about sex in a minute. Let your brain get used to that. And let's start with something a little more benign. So let's use, I like your example. We don't need to drink alcohol to survive, but, a little drink now and then, whatever for most people. Think of nicotine, right? We don't need to smoke cigarettes to survive. Plants made it as a toxin. We probably shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. No, it hasn't been. It's actually antithetical to our survival. So we don't need to smoke to survive. But what about food? Well, we do have to eat. Okay. So my lab's actually done studies with both of these things. And it's really interesting to see what happens. So people can actually take nicotine and quit smoking cigarettes in a way where, if they have cravings that, once they've stopped completely, then they don't have to be around cigarettes. But if somebody has been overeating for a long time, they can't just say, well, I'm going to avoid food for the rest of my life, right? It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And so I think sex is a similar thing, right? So with food, what we have people do is we have them pay attention as they eat. Okay, we've actually embedded a tool. We have a paper that was just accepted for publication that shows this, where if we have people pay attention as they go through a mindful eating program, this Eat Right Now app, they can update the reward value in their brain of how rewarding overeating is versus not overeating. And are you ready for this? It only takes 10 to 12 times of them going through this mindfulness exercise to really clearly see what they're getting and to update that reward value in their brain. What that updated reward value does is it helps them naturally stop overeating. And we see a shift in behavior from overeating to not overeating, okay? So we can see this specifically with some substance that we actually need to survive. So the parallel I would suggest is that we can see, what am I getting? So if it's internet porn. So for example, when I was a kid, there was no internet porn. It was like you had to steal not that I did this, but you had to steal a magazine from the drugstore or whatever, wherever they carried porn.
Or go into that creepy section in Blockbuster. It was like behind the door,
That was oddly specific.
Not that I've done that before.
Yeah. And I'm sure kids were not allowed in that creepy section. I actually did. Yeah. So there's that example where kids can get internet porn at any time. So and you can try to block and all that. It probably doesn't work. So the idea here is that the ready access to these types of things, kids who are just exploring can get access to something that is really graphic and really live, as compared to a magazine, which probably is not as, as arousing. And they can do this, and they can, they're all this stuff, they can masturbate, they can do all sorts of things that are just going to perpetuate it, that just drives the need to do it more. So it drives their craving for more as compared to doing it in a natural setting. It's like food that's designed to be addictive, right? We're going to, what's the potato chip? I bet you can't just eat just one. Yeah, because we designed it that way, right? So the idea is to get people to keep consuming. And this is probably the idea with porn as well, is you get people consuming to the point where they're missing the whole point. The potato chip isn't about nutritive value. It's about consumption. Porn isn't about, oh, let's teach you how to have a healthy relationship with your sexual partner. This, and this is where you can watch it go to extremes, where our brains become habituated to, like, what is it, soft porn or whatever. People get habituated and they're like, yeah, I've seen enough. Give me something else, and they need more and more and more and more. And then these kids get to this place where, like, whoa, what, and they're like, this is what sex is. And you're like, oh my God, where did you learn that? And it's because their brains have been just constantly like needing that dopamine hit where they've become habituated to the other. So here you can think of this as it's just our brains getting caught up in something that is designed to get us caught up in it, to the point where we miss the whole point of what it is. Oh, healthy relationships, procreation, just like food is about getting us nutrients in a healthy way. And now people are just addicted to junk food.
Gotcha.
So I could be totally incorrect here, but I've heard something along the lines of brain damage happening from, unresolved, maybe addictions, traumas, anxiety, depression. Is that maybe why it's even harder to break these habits and addictions, is because there is potentially some, brain damage that's happened, especially if it's long term? I mean, I could be totally incorrect here, but I'd love to get your take on that.
That's a good question. There's certainly some solid research showing that when people use substances over and over and over chronically, that their brains change. There can be cortical thinning, like our brains get smaller, things like that. So I think there is really good, solid scientific evidence for that, especially with chemical substances, which really jack the dopamine system hard. And they also do, jack a bunch of other systems. And we're not exactly sure what is causing, it's called the brain damage or the cortical changes. But the nice thing here is, the basic learning process, if we lose that, we're in a much worse shape. We're in much bigger trouble than other things. So that's it's kind of tucked away in a safe place. It's like padded, And so the learning piece is one that really is protected. And so if we can learn things, we can unlearn them. And I know this, I've had people who have, let's say, chronic worriers. I've had people who have been worrying for, 20 or 30 years. And I'll give you a concrete example. I actually write about this in my book. I had a patient who came in to my office. He was about 40 years of age. He had full-blown panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And he had had this for over 30 years. This had started when he was a kid, right? So he had reinforced those processes forever. And he was also very overweight because he was eating as a compensatory mechanism, right? Within a year, he had lost 100 pounds. And he had panic about driving on the highway. He had gone from avoiding driving altogether to, no kidding, becoming an Uber driver. Okay.
Wow.
So I think that's just
powerful.
good. Yeah. It just shows how plastic our brain is. Everybody loves to throw around the term neuroplasticity. Well, that just means that our brain isn't fixed, which is really good because the world is constantly changing. We need to keep adapting to keep pace with the world. And so if we've done something for 40 years, I've had plenty of people who quit smoking after decades and decades of smoking, right? We can do this no matter how much we've pruned of our brain. Those basic mechanisms are still at play.
That's awesome.
Yeah, great information.
So I think that's a great segue into what has probably been considered one of the most pervasive and harmful addictions of the modern era, and that is social media. And we have kind of talked about it. It's one of those interesting things that, kind of like sex, people will talk about as a necessity for some type of survival, right? Like, well, I have a business, I have to run my business through social media. And so, we seem to have a lot of excuses why we can't get off of it. But it seems like it's doing more harm than good right now. And I'd love to get your take on social media and what people can do to exist in the modern world where social media is as prevalent as it is, without falling down that rabbit hole of chronic social addiction.
Yeah. Well, maybe you left out me because I think social media is perfect. I mean, I only use it to keep up with my high school friends that I haven't talked to in 30 years.
Oh, good. Well,
I'm
okay.
kidding.
So give us the keys to the kingdom.
I'm kidding. Yeah. So I think the parallel here is, well, we've been talking about food, right? And we've been talking about sex. So with food, we have to eat to survive. And for the modern world, I think social media is not going away. It's the biggest form of advertisement. My lab even uses Facebook ads to recruit for study participants, right? It's helpful. So it's kind of like me trying to navigate Boston without a map and suddenly not having my phone. It's like, that phone's kind of helpful because I'm going to get lost in this abyss of streets that don't make any sense, and I'm going to starve to death because I'll never be able to find my way out of here. So I think if we look at technology and social media in particular as kind of this neutral thing, right? It can provide information, it can help us connect with others, it can help us advertise, it can help us, we can listen to or watch podcasts so that we can get information, right? So the internet is neutral. It's really how we use it. And actually, this is why I wrote this new book, was that it's blown me away how little people know about their own minds. Even, how people are talking about this scientifically and developing treatments. They're not focusing on this very basic reward-based learning mechanism. And so with social media, for example, or the internet and all this, if we know some very basic things about how our minds work, we can actually tame that, where we can see, oh, social media, I can use the beneficial aspects and I can let go of the others. Just like, oh, here's food. I can lean toward food that's nutritive, right? I can eat. So for me, I used to eat gummy worms and I would get addicted to them. I couldn't have a bag in the house because I just eat the whole thing because I knew I was going to feel terrible, but at least there wouldn't be any more gummy worms, right? Until I started comparing those to eating blueberries. And my brain was like, dude, this tastes like petroleum, these gummy worms, and these blueberries, they taste pretty good. And I don't have a craving for more afterwards because I'm satisfied, right? So in the same way, we can approach social media or the internet in that way. We can say, where am I addicted? Where am I going on social media to get information and just, catching social contagion of outrage and fear from other people, right? Not helpful. And where can I go on there and say, okay, I need to do this for my business? What's helpful? And and where can I not kind of get caught up in that? And in fact, it's not that hard to do. It's really about tapping into finding that balance. I call it the pleasure plateau, where, where's is it just enough? It's like food, right? When somebody's overeating, I have them pay attention with each bite and ask themselves, is this better or worse than the last, right? And where they can find, okay, that's actually tipping over. It's not as pleasurable. Oh, maybe I'm full. Oh, maybe I'm eating because I'm bored or whatever. They can stop doing that simply by bringing that awareness in. And I think we can do the same thing with, say, social media. We're scrolling through and we can ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? Is it serving whatever purpose I clicked to satisfy, or is it just that I'm bored or I'm addicted to this? And we can start to see the difference so that we naturally become disenchanted with the part that's not helping. And then we can focus more on the part that is.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk a lot about hacking cravings with curiosity. Does this fall into that? Because I love the analogy of potato chips and kind of comparing that to social media. Potato chips were designed to get you to come back, time and time again. It's an addictive product. And as we saw from the social dilemma, Facebook and Instagram are just that. They are designed. They have people not as smart as you, but close to it, on their staff trying to figure out how do we get people addicted to that simple act of scrolling. Same is true with online dating. It's this swipe right, swipe left. It's we've become so enchanted with that ping of dopamine, and so in doing in creating these environments where people are doing that, they're just looking for the next hit of dopamine, how do they use this curiosity to really break that? Because I mean, I'm a rather intelligent guy. I know the dangers of social media, and yet I still find myself being like, oh, great, another cat video. Awesome.
I mean, the cat
So-
videos are good, though.
The cat
Yeah, I was
videos
going
are
to
good.
say, this is not knocking cat videos. As long as,
Yeah.
So I think the key here is to really understand this process, right? And so the swiping and the swiping and the swiping is like a rat pressing a lever, okay? And so it's really about, and sorry, I keep saying, I wrote a book about this, but it's really a 3-step process. And that's how I set up that the process in the book is based on this, where if we can just start to see these habit patterns, right? If we can see, oh, I'm just scrolling, what is it? 3 steps, right? There, like, what's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? That's the first step in being able to step out of this, okay? Now we think, oh, well, it's the Western world, it's reason, it's willpower, let's beat the passions. That's not how our brains work. There was this great skit from Bob Newhart. He was this comedian from the 70s, right? He had this skit called
I'll
Just
show you some stuff
Stop
on
It. Yeah. So he had this skit, Just Stop It. Woman walks into the therapist's office and she says, oh, I have this fear of being buried alive in a box. That's how it starts. And he basically gives this thing and he says, I'm going to charge you for the first 5 minutes. And then she's like, okay. And because he says, you won't need the rest. And then he leans over his desk and he goes, just stop it. Right. and then she's like, what about this? And he says, just stop it. And she says, what about this? And he says, just stop it. Well, boy, it'd be great if patient walks into my office and I could be like, just stop smoking, just stop overeating, just stop worrying. One visit, 5 minutes, we'd be done. I could find another profession. That would be awesome, right? That's not how our brains work. So first, we have to map out how our whatever the habit loop is. I think of it as a habit loop. So if I'm stress eating, it's stress that's triggering me to eat. And then what's the result of that? Well, I feel bloated, right? So that's the first step, is just mapping it out. And then the second step is hacking this reward-based learning system. If it's really strong and we can't trust the reasoning willpower part of our brain, the weakest part that goes offline when we get stressed or anxious, we can trust that stronger part from an evolutionary perspective. So we can hack that reward value and ask, what am I getting from this? Whether it's stress eating or scrolling on social media or whatever, we can ask, what am I actually getting? Is it making me more afraid? Is it making me more anxious? Is it making me more outraged? Or am I just wasting a ton of time and then numbing my brain, right? When we do that, we start to get disenchanted. Our brain updates that reward value and says, oh, it's not as rewarding as I thought. Just like with my patients, I tell them to smoke when they want to quit smoking. They're like, who is this guy? I want to quit smoking. You're telling me to smoke. And I say, pay attention as you smoke. And they realize that cigarettes taste like crap, right? They start to become disenchanted. I don't tell them to stop smoking. I tell them to smoke. And from that awareness helps them update it. Same is true for social media. Same is true for any behavior. Procrastination, what do I get from that? So the second step is I just tell people to ask yourself, what am I getting from this? Not in an intellectual way, but truly experience, feel it. Is the worrying fixing the problem, or is it making me more anxious? And then from there, I love this third step. I call it bring in the BBO, the bigger, better offer, right? So if our brain is based on reward hierarchies, give it something better. And it's nothing against cute pictures of kittens or videos of kittens. I love kitten videos myself. But our brain, when we've got a big project to do and there's a deadline, I'm going to guess that looking at kitten videos doesn't get the project done. I'm just going to go out on a limb there and probably not going to help, right? So
I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, fair. So we can only distract ourselves so much. We can only eat so much food. We can only drink so much. And it's going to be temporary relief, and it's going to cause its own problems. What's it? The quarantine 15 turned into quarantine 20 and the quarantine 30 as people gain more and more weight, right? They turn into their own problems. So we have to find a bigger, better offer that's not going to perpetuate the problem and create problems on its own. So here's where I think of two categories of things: kindness and curiosity, right? We can get, if we're anxious or worried, in that moment, we can get curious. Oh, what does this feel like? Instead of, oh no, is the worst thing, worst case scenario going to actually come true? That, oh, feels better than worrying or being anxious. So right in that moment, we're doing two things. One, we're finding a bigger, better offer. It feels better. And we're stepping out of the worry habit loop. Because if we go, oh, we drop into our experience and we map this out and we see, oh, worry's not helping, we're already starting to become disenchanted with it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So much.
So how long does that take?
Great question. I love that because there's a meme on the internet that it takes 21 days to start a new habit.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I was writing a chapter in my Unwinding Anxiety book about that because it comes up so often. So I chased down the meme. Are you ready for this? A book written, I think, in the 1960s by a plastic surgeon who just suggested that it took about 3 weeks for his patients to get used to their new nose job. That was it.
Wow.
And then boom, internet must be true, and then people cite it on their blogs, and then they cite the blogs in their books because they haven't done the primary research.
Yeah.
And so that's where that as one has come from. I think that's the most common one that I see.
Well, and I can't tell you the number of, lectures that I've been to or seminars that I've been to, and they quote that 21 days to create a new habit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that really true?
Yeah. So you can ask them, was that your nose job or somebody else's nose job?
Yeah. How's your mom's new nose looking?
So because that meme may not be true, my lab actually did the studies, right? And so we looked at smoking and we looked at eating, okay? And so we can actually calculate the reward value and the change in reward value and change in behavior. And it's not necessarily time, it's really quality over quantity. And so in our Eat Right Now app, we embedded, I think I mentioned, we embedded this mindfulness practice and we had people pay attention. And it took them 10 to 15 times. I'm going to repeat that because this is crazy. 10 to 15 times of noticing what they're getting from overeating for them to shift that reward value and shift their behavior. And it was similar for smoking. It took a little bit longer and not, a little more messy in terms of the data. But for eating, we replicated this study several times, 10 to 15 times. And really, it's about our brains needing to be plastic, right? We can't, if the saber-toothed tiger is chasing us, or if there's new danger in the jungle, we can't have like 30 or 50 times of being chased before we learn, oh, that's probably a dangerous thing. We have to learn these things pretty quickly. We need to update that reward value. And so this fits with what makes sense is if we pay attention and the more we see how unrewarding something is, the more quickly we will drop that bad habit, kick it to the curb, so to speak. And the more rewarding we see good habits are, the more those will stick quickly. So for example, again, my lab did another study where we looked at reward value of a bunch of mental states. And we found, surprise, that anxiety and frustration and anger, they're all very low. People rank them low on their list. And high on their list is kindness and curiosity. So if people can see clearly how rewarding it is to be connected, to be kind, to be curious, they can start to develop those habits even more quickly, the more they see how rewarding those are.
Fascinating.
So much amazing.
One thing that brings up is this concept that I think we've heard a lot about as of late, and it's not COVID derived, but this idea of self-sabotage is that there are a contingent of people who, for whatever reason, they just have to sabotage themselves, and whether that's through behavior, whether that's through breaking of relationships. So how does that play into this idea of kind of hacking, a craving or hacking a behavior with curiosity and kindness when we've got people who are predisposed to, almost doing the opposite, even though they fundamentally, intellectually, and psychologically might recognize the inherent value of changing that behavior?
Yeah. So I think you're hitting on something important. They might intellectually understand that this is a bad thing. It's not going to help me survive. But our thinking brain doesn't hold a candle to our feeling body. So it's really the urges and that restless quality that drives us to continue a behavior or to do something else. So here it starts with just understanding the process. And I think this self-sabotage probably falls into a greater category of self-judgment, right? So I think anybody can relate to judging themselves. And so if we just map out those elements, what's the trigger, what's the behavior, what's the result? So the trigger might be that we do something. Let's say I'm on a podcast and there are two great hosts and I'm nervous and I say something, I'm like, oh, that was stupid. Why did I say that? it's probably not a good idea for me to start judging myself in the middle of the podcast because I'll forget what the next question is. What was that? Yeah, I'm just kidding. So the idea here, the idea here is, sorry, I'm terrible at humor. So there I can judge myself over that, right? Be like, oh, I shouldn't have even tried that. That was a terrible joke.
Hey, she doesn't laugh often, and she's laughed a lot in this podcast.
I laugh all the time.
Okay. So here's a great example. I just created one, right? So I can start judging myself for trying to make a joke, and then remember all the times where my wife is like, Jud, that funny thing, leave it to the funny people, just
like, I didn't marry you for your sense of humor.
Yes, she did not. So the idea here is, if I'm judging myself, I can map that out. Oh, there's this thought, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have tried to be funny. And then I'm beating myself up over it, right? And then I can ask, what am I getting from this? Is this helping me actually be articulate on a podcast? Probably not, because my prefrontal cortex starts going offline. So I can map that out, and I can ask myself, what am I getting from this? So I can ask myself right now, it's like, well, what will I get if I start beating myself up over this? Well, I'm going to get contracted. I'm going to get closed down. I'm going to go into kind of tunnel vision survival mode, and I'm not going to be able to respond to these questions, right? And have a good conversation, because I'll be focused on me rather than us having a great conversation. So there, with self-sabotage or self-judgment or whatever, same process applies. We can map it out, step one. Step two, we can ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? And as we start to notice this, and I've done this a lot for myself, because it's really helped me with my own self-judgment, it's like, wow, that is really not helpful, right? And it starts to leave almost like a bad taste in my mouth. It's like, I'm starting to realize that self-flagellation actually hurts. It's not like something I'm doing to stimulate my endorphins or something like that. It actually leaves welts on my back. That's harmful. And when we can do that, then we can bring in the bigger, better offer. Well, what feels better than beating myself up? Well, if I'm curious, like, oh, well, maybe you should try humor live on a podcast. Oh, maybe I can learn that for the next one so that I don't try that again. And if I bring kindness to myself, I'll be like, well, beating yourself up's not going to help. Just give myself a hug. Something like that feels much better. So I can bring in that bigger, better offer. And I think this is really important for all of us. I'm thinking of one of the patients that I wrote about in my book, was that she had binge eating disorder, was very overweight, and one of her big issues was that she couldn't look at herself in the mirror because she just judged herself so much. So we actually helped her map that out, see that she wasn't getting anything from self-judgment, and bring in some kindness toward herself. And that loving kindness was really helpful for her in kind of turning that around, so that she could see that she loved herself. She could even start to like herself again. Really, really powerful for any of us that do anything like that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, such amazing information. And it's, we always think, I love your steps too, and it seems very simple. And I think if people are willing to apply it, they could make a lot of transition and change in their life. Obviously, breaking free from habits and addictions is challenging, but I love these steps. And I think a huge, huge part of it is just understanding that we have to be so aware and observant of what we're doing, what we're thinking, and how it's applying, into our lives, and how it's modifying our lives for the better or for worse. So I think that's just such amazing information. Yeah.
I just want to highlight something you said, because it's really important. So it's about awareness, right? This isn't about willpower. This isn't about being the smartest person in the room and figuring out how our brains work. Like, really, neuroscientists, we don't know a whole lot about how the brain works. We know a few things, but we can learn to help our brains learn about themselves. And awareness is the key ingredient for all of that, right? You have to be aware to map out a habit loop. You have to be aware to see how unrewarding the old behavior is. You have to be aware to see how rewarding the new behavior is, right? So I'm so glad you highlighted that.
Yeah.
So we're about out of time, but I have one final question that kind of brings us full circle back to something that you said in the beginning, is you would go to these meditation retreats, 30 days, quiet type of thing. And you would get into this, I'd start meditating, and then, like, I have to go write down the greatest idea in the world. I think a lot of people are suffering through that. We understand that meditation is so important, that this mindfulness practice is so important, but so many people, myself included, who used to actually be really good at meditation, have fallen into this trap of, I get like 30 seconds, a minute into it, and I'm like, shit, like I got stuff to do. Like my ego kicks in, and I'm like, I got to go take care of this. So you, having gone through this with all of your credentials, with all of your research, what are some practical tools that people can do to really implement mindfulness in this day and age when things are just so freaking chaotic?
Yeah. So the first thing, I would say is, you don't have to be any special person to be able to do this, right? So true story, I get into medical school and I go on my first 7-day silent meditation retreat a couple of years in, right? And by the day 3, I'm crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager who I don't know. And so here I was like, I can get into medical school, but I can't pay attention to my breath. What's wrong with me, right? So it's not about being a certain type of person. Anybody can meditate, but I would say the key thing I didn't know, and I actually didn't know this for 10 years, was that it's not about paying attention to my breath. Paying attention to my breath isn't going to magically help me stop scrolling on social media, right? It's not going to help me stop, getting panic attacks on the highway. But knowing how my mind works will. And so meditation, I think of it as a small circle within a larger circle of mindfulness, right? You can think of meditation helping us remove some of the distractors so that we can really sit down, sometimes literally sit down, but you could be walking, you could be doing, it's not just about being in a sitting posture, but it's really about seeing, okay, how does my mind work? That's the fundamental question, right? If we can see how in Buddhism, they talk about cause and effect, right? What's the behavior and what's the effect? Is it causing more suffering? Is it causing less suffering? So there, if we're meditating, we can start to see, oh, if I'm daydreaming about the world's greatest idea, is it causing more suffering? Yes, because if I go home and tell everybody and they're like, are you kidding? That's a terrible idea, right? There's suffering, right? I was like, but I spent 30 days meditating on this. And they're like, I don't care if you spend a year, it's still a bad idea, right? So is it causing more suffering or less suffering? And for example, when on one of these retreats, I started to see that when I was excited about an idea, it caused me to want to think about it more. If I was judging myself about something, it caused me to want to beat myself up more. That wanting was common, whether it was pleasant or unpleasant. And when I could start to see that, then I could start to ask, what am I getting from this? Oh, it's just making me want more pleasant things and want to get away from unpleasant things and want to distract myself and want. Boy, there was a lot of suffering in that. So here, pragmatically, you're asking about practical tools. The first thing I would say is understand what this is about. It's not about ridding your mind of thoughts. It's not about calming yourself. It's not about levitating. It's not about any of these things. It's about really helping you understand how your mind works. So you can see when you're causing things that are increasing your suffering and when you're causing things that are decreasing it. When you can see these clearly, you'll naturally let go of them, like the things that are causing suffering. When you see the things that are helping you and the world, because they're rewarding, you will do them more. And so any type of meditation that can help us see those mental patterns will help. And even in some of our studies, our first study was smoking. This is the one where we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking cessation. We actually found that informal mindfulness practices were more effective. They moderated the effects of smoking cessation even more than the formal mindfulness practice, the formal meditations. So both can be helpful, but the in the moment pieces may be especially helpful when we're caught up in scrolling on social media or we're caught up in going to the refrigerator or whatever, because it's not like, if I'm driving and I start to get anxious, I can't just pull over and pull out my meditation cushion and meditate on the side of the highway. It's about in that moment. Oh, there's the thought. Oh, can I get curious? Oh, there's the thought. Oh, it's leading me to feel contracted. Oh, there's a sensation. And instead of getting caught up in, oh no, I'm going to have a panic attack, it can be, oh, this is, not necessarily great, but it's like, oh, this is happening. And we don't get caught up in it.
Yeah, I love the curiosity. I think that's super important.
Hacking cravings with curiosity.
It's awesome. Oh, this is a fantastic interview.
Yeah.
I loved all this information. This is so great, Dr. Jud. Thank you.
I'm not going to go meditate right now. I'm just going to go be aware and practice curiosity.
Sounds like a great idea.
I think we would all benefit from that, just as a whole. Society as a whole would benefit just from that alone too.
I think that the title for this is "Show Me Your O Face."
I love it.
Oh, I kind of hate that I like that too.
Yeah, I know you do.
That's funny.
Dr. Jud, where can people get in contact with you? We'll put all of your information in the show notes, but the books, the app, where do we want people to find you?
The book is called Unwinding Anxiety. They can find it on my website, drjud.com. The apps that I mentioned, they're commercially available. Anybody can download them. They can also find more information on my website, drjud.com. But the apps are called Craving to Quit for Smoking. For if somebody wants to work with their eating, it's called Eat Right Now. And then for the anxiety, same name as the book, Unwinding Anxiety. I'm also on Twitter at Jud Brewer, JudBrewer.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation with Dr. Jud Brewer. We've touched on things that we've been wanting to discuss for quite some time, and that's everything from digital addiction to sex addiction to how do we use mindfulness to fix a lot of the issues that we all seem to be suffering through right now, especially in the age of COVID. We do our very best to bring you the very best guests in the world on some of these topics, and I feel like we crushed this one. Janna did. It has nothing to do with me. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll put all of his information in the show notes. If you're having any of the issues that we talked about, make sure to reach out to some of the assets we provided for you. I think there's a lot of great value here. And, we could all use a little more mindfulness in our existence.
Absolutely.
I guess that's all I got.
That's it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning into another edition of the Complete Human Podcast with your host,
Janna Breslin.
and Evan DeMarco. We will see you next week.
Hi, everyone.